Um, as was stated earlier, I'm from a member of the Blackfeet Indian tribe in Montana, and I grew up. I was born there. I was partly raised there, but most of my life has been influenced by the Native American traditions, and I grew up in it, and it was very, very much a part, and still is much a part of my life. Um, there is an old saying that many different tribal communities in the United States has made at various times as I've traveled and made films in those native communities as well as outside. Um, there is a statement that they've always said to me is that we exist because of the story. And that was always such a very profound statement to me because, in fact, if we sit down and actually think about our existence on this planet, it oftentimes comes back to us through the story, whether we tell it to ourselves or we tell it to each other. It is a way that we come together as a community, as a world community, as individual small communities. It's something that's very critical to our existence. Um, and as I have uh, gone through my life and career, I ended up being a storyteller in the tradition of my family through film and television. It wasn't something I intended to do, but it just sort of was a part of my life growing up, that stories were critical to my daily life. Everything I know about the world came to me through the stories. Even when we go to school and go to other experiences traveling around the world, stories come to us every day, every moment. And in a way, for me, the story is a ritual. It's something that is so critical to our sense of ourselves and the sense of others. And so I'm going to begin telling you a few stories that I have about my own life and how I actually got into film. I am now 70 years old, but when I was 26 years old, I was diagnosed with incurable, inoperable cancer. And I had lymphoma. And as I laid in my bed trying to figure out what I was going to do with those few weeks that the doctors told me I had left to live, I decided that I would like to make a film. It was sort of an interesting idea for me because I grew up an introvert, and going to movies and going to theater gave me a chance to see and experience the world without having to be to extend myself. And as a result, as I laid there in the bed, I said, you know, I'd really like to tell a story through film, and that's something that that came to mind before I would pass away. A friend of mine came into the hospital as I was recovering from my surgery, and he said, I don't know how you're going to do this. You have no training, you have no money. How can you do this? And I said, I really don't know. I just have the impetus, the desire to do something that I haven't and have always wanted to do. He said to me that he knew someone in our town that had a film school, and that it was a very elite film school. They only took 4 students a year, and it was very expensive. But he said, you know, I know you don't have the money, and I certainly know you don't have the time. You've been given only a few weeks to live. But maybe he can give you advice as to what you can do. And so we set up a meeting a few weeks later after I got out of the hospital, and I went to this film school and met this very unique looking man wearing a cowboy hat with lead around the band, and he smoked Lucky Strikes and kind of had an odd posture about him, but I remember he had puffing away on his cigarette and leaning into me and saying, "Why is it so important for you to make this film?" And I told him that I only had a little bit of time left to live, and that was something I always wanted to do. And at the same time, I just felt that it was a way for me to sort of have some form of affirmation of my life here on this planet. He began to tell me a story, and so I'm telling you a story within a story here. The story he told me was that when he was young, he raced motorcycles and had an accident, which enabled him afterwards, the insurance after his accident gave him the ability to buy a Harley-Davidson franchise in Manhattan. And he worked a lot, sold bikes and did maintenance on motorcycles for people in the film business. There were a lot of people in the film business that had motorcycles. And he got very interested in the film business and eventually ended up becoming a film producer and director himself. But one of the men who came into his shop had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He had lung cancer and it was given 3 months left to live. And he came in to talk to Carol about buying. He wanted a motorcycle, and what he had decided was that in the first month of that he had of the rest of his life, he wanted to take care of his business and make sure all the paperwork and so forth was taken care of. The second month of his life, he wanted to spend with his family and quality time and saying goodbye. In the third month of his life, he decided he wanted to do a lifelong dream, which he was never able to achieve, which was to see the world on a motorcycle. And so Carol fixed up the motorcycle so he could put camping gear and so forth on, and he came in and picked up the motorcycle and drove out. 4 years later, he drove back into the shop, and Carol was quite surprised, obviously, and said to him, "I thought you were dying of cancer." And he said, "Well, I did too. But I found myself several months into my trip, and driving through Brazil, I went by a hospital, and I found that there was no cancer in my lungs any longer." Carol, the film producer, turned to me and he says, "I have a feeling that your movie is kind of like the motorcycle." And although I sort of got the idea somewhat, I to make a film. But I told him, I said, "You know, you haven't really told me anything about what I need to do to actually learn how to make a film." And he said, "Well, show up for class on Monday morning." I said, "Well, I don't think you really heard me. One, I don't have the money, and two, I don't have the time." And he said, "Well, I don't think you heard me." He said, "If you really want to make a film, then you show up for my class on Monday morning." And I again protested, and he again said, "You're not listening to me. Show up for class on Monday morning, and you'll be on your way to making the film you want to make." What he ended up doing was giving me a full scholarship to attend his course. I happened to had already served in the military, so I had a GI Bill that enabled me to eat and feed my family. And within the next few months, I had made 2 student films, and I managed to actually finish the 9-month course. At 3 months into my classes, doctors, my oncologist and my radiologist, called me into their office and said, "We would like to talk to you." And I thought, well, this must be it. They must be saying that death is near, and they want to prepare me for that. I went into the office, and they had light boxes behind their desk, and the X-rays of my tumors were clearly visible on one set. On the other set of X-rays, there were no tumors. And they said, you know, this doesn't happen very often, but we no longer see those 300 tumors that we saw in your body several months ago. And things like this do happen unexplained, and we don't have any way of explaining why, because the treatment that you were in really shouldn't have been able to do what we're seeing on the X-rays. And he says, so we ask the patients when these sort of odd things happen, and we'd like to know what you think. What have you been doing besides the treatment? And I said, well, I think it has something to do with the motorcycle. At any rate, as it turned out, I no longer had the cancer in my body, and I had a whole new career. And now 85 films and over 2,500 television programs later, here I sit. So what I wanted to sort of share with you is the fact that there are many different ways by which we journey through our lives. Sometimes it's just on a physical level, sometimes it's on a spiritual level, sometimes a combination of both. And what I've came to find is that we truly have the ability to heal ourselves. Sometimes we don't always know exactly what that method or that process is about. We kind of stumble our way through it, and some don't. But many of us who are survivors of cancer have found that there is this other aspect of our lives that we're not always fully aware of or in touch with. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about today is that connection to what we can't see. But we certainly have some instinct that it exists. There's some other level by which we function as human beings on this planet. And it's not always in the physical sense. We have suspicions that, and also I think, I'm sorry, I will just stop for a minute. What I wanted to say is our tendency is to want to categorize or to put some sort of nomenclature on this kind of spiritual experience that we have. And there's many different kinds of what I would call spiritual experiences that human beings participate in. Then in my native culture, my elders and my teachers have always said to me that the physical part of being human is only one small aspect of our infinite journey that we are on as spiritual entities, that we are in fact spiritual entities first, and then physical entities secondly. This time we have on this planet, this time we have on this earth is in their eyes a time of learning, a time of experiencing something outside the realm of our spiritual existence. It's for our own continuum and our own growth. In the other story I wanted to share with you, and these may not seem to have a lot of connection to them, but growing up, I found myself, my mother was divorced from my father, and as a result, she had to go to work, and she was an accountant who had to travel continually for the federal government, and we lived a very haphazard kind of lifestyle in that we would only live couple of months in each location and then move on. And it was very difficult for my sister and I because we were always changing school 4 or 5 times a year. But that travel also gave us a challenge that was, for me, later on proved to be very beneficial, because as a filmmaker traveling the world, it enabled me to feel very comfortable in that position. One of the things that was difficult for me was that I had been on many Indian reservations as a result of my work, but I'd never really had a whole close relationship with my own culture. I would spend maybe a month or so with my father on a ranch in a very remote area, so I didn't have a whole lot of contact with other members of my tribe growing up. So as I became an adult and as I became successful as a filmmaker, I began to sort of discuss or entertain the idea that I wanted to go home and reconnect with my own tribal community and have that experience. So I went up to the reservation and I met a man who I found to be my mentor in life. His name was Daryl Kipp, and Mr. Kipp and I were born 2 weeks apart from each other, and he was kind of like an older brother for me, in that he opened up my own tribal community in a way that I don't think anyone else could have. He was in our tradition, chiefs were not elected. They just were recognized as being leaders, people who had the ability to give something and lead the people under different circumstances, whether it was in times of difficulty in finding food, or if it was in times of warfare or any other sort of major challenge that the community was having. Chiefs became known by everyone because they had certain skills and ability to solve the problems and lead the people. And my friend Daryl was one of these human beings, and very much an important man. He was a PhD in linguistics from Harvard. At the same time, he grew up in the Native community and knew the history and the culture, and was very much involved in bringing the language that we were losing back to the people through an organization he had started, in which he created a concept of immersion training, so that young people, when they first went to school, would speak in the language and learn their education through the native language. When I asked him, I said, I'm trying to figure out how to come home, and I'm not really sure how to do that. And he said, you know, George, he said, if that's what you want, just come home. That's all it takes. Just get in the car and come. He said the best time to come would be in the summer, and we are all, well, there's this special lake on our reservation. Many of us have cabins on. Why don't you come up in August and spend the month of August with me? I had a 2-day drive to get there, and when I arrived very late in the evening. In fact, everyone had already gone to bed in my friend's home. And so I drove down the road to a campground, and this is in the Rocky Mountains near Glacier National Park. And beautiful lakes, beautiful mountains. Summertime, it was August, full moon night. And I found this campground, and the man who was running the campground said, you know, just go find a spot and I'll take care of you in the morning. It was very late, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning. So I had a little 3-man dome tent. I pitched it next to my car, and I left the door open so I could see this beautiful landscape as I went to sleep. There's hot mountains that go straight into the lake, and just incredible landscape that surrounded me. I decided to leave the tent door open. When I woke up a little while later, I saw the same landscape, but there was something a little bit odd. There was a black hole in the middle of my vision, and I couldn't quite understand why I couldn't see this into this circle. I couldn't understand what it was. But then I could hear this sniffing, and I realized that there was an animal sniffing me right within inches of my face. And the more I came awake, I realized that it was a bear. And I had some experience in filming bears in Alaska and Canada, and I always had certain knowledge about how to deal with a bear from a bit of a distance. This was way too close. In fact, I found myself feeling like my blood was turning to stone. I was so frightened, and I realized there was not much I could really do but just to lie there. And 1,000 things go through your mind in moments like this when you realize that you're in really grave danger. And I remembered one of the elders once saying to me, this is the time that we have to really surrender to our lives, to our moment, to our death, to our beginning, to all things. And surrender is not giving up. Surrender is accepting what is. And I remember those words as I was lying there, but at the same time, I can't say that I was. This is probably the time when I was most frightened in my life. And the next thing I knew, I went out. It wasn't until later that I realized that what had happened was that I passed out. And when I woke again, the bear was leaning on me. In fact, his body was kind of leaning up against my shoulder and my head, and he was eating what sounded like a picnic table. I'd never heard such horrendous crushing and mashing of teeth on something, and I had no idea what it was, but it sounded maybe like bone, but it wasn't me. And then again, I went out, and when I woke again, this time he was a little leaning even more on me, and I could feel the weight. I was actually a little afraid I might be crushed. But he was sleeping, and I could smell this very musty, kind of funky smell of the bear hide, and it right in my face. And I really wasn't sure what to do at that moment, but just to lie there. And then again, I went out. And in some ways, I think maybe it was some sort of primordial response to actually as a part of survival, I guess. When I woke again, the bear was gone, and I was really quite confused as to what I should do. The car was only a few feet away, and all I had to do was jump up and crawl in. But also, having been around bears, I know that they can be very quiet. A bear could be just a few feet away in the darkness, and as I moved to try to get in the car, he might grab me. So I stayed in my tent. Well, this process happened a few times that night, and each time I was passing out, I'm sure. But finally, I woke up in the morning and found, other campers in the campground were cooking breakfast, and dogs were barking, and kids were playing. And it sort of felt good, and I wasn't sure that this wasn't some sort of nightmare that I had the night before. So I looked out in front of my tent to find these large bear paw prints in the ground. And I thought to myself, it really did happen, but how in the world can I explain to anyone that I slept with a grizzly bear? And at that time I didn't know it was a grizzly, but I knew it was a bear. I got up every morning normally to run, and I would put on my jogging clothes and my tennis shoes, and I would run. So this morning I got up and I ran on a forest trail, and I came, or a road actually, and I came up on two native Indian cowboys having coffee and smoking cigarettes, leaning against their pickup truck on the side of the road. And as I ran by, I waved hello, and they waved back. Behind the truck was a trailer that really held a live bear trap. It's actually a steel culvert that has a door on one end, and they usually put some sort of food or something inside to lure the bears in, and then once they get inside, the door shuts. As I ran by, I could see this bear's nostril or nose sticking out of one of the windows on the side, and it was almost as if he was looking at me and saying, "Hey buddy, help me." And I turned around and went to the two Indian men who's sitting by the truck, and I asked him, I said, "What kind of bear is that?" And he said, "Well, it's a grizzly bear. He's been around this campground, and we're game wardens, and we put this trap down because he's been around the campground for the last few days." I said, "What are you going to do with him?" And he said, "Well, we'll take him clear on the other side of the mountain range and let him loose, and hopefully he won't come back." So I jogged around down the road, and as by the bear trap, I looked at the bear and I said, "Don't come back." Well, the next morning, I actually packed up my camp, and I went down that morning to my friend's house, and everyone was cooking breakfast, and there were several relatives who were camped out in teepees around the house. And I was really in a quandary as to whether or not I could tell anybody that could actually have that close of an encounter and survive it. So I think the part that the reason I wanted to tell you about this story was that when I went to my friend Daryl and asked him or told him about my experience and my trepidation in even telling him about it, he just sort of laughed at me and said, "Well, you know, the Blackfeet Indians, we've always had this very special relationship with the bear, and especially the grizzly bear, which has been a part of our experience for thousands of years." And he says it's a very special thing. He said, in my mind, he says it's just a one way of this place welcoming you home. Several years later, I had built a cabin on that very same lake, and was got a knock at the door, and my friend Daryl walked in the door, and he said to me, "I have something for you." And he handed me an envelope in which there was a photograph of the tribal council. My father was the tribal chief for almost 40 years. And this photograph was of the tribal council, or 1 year of the tribal council, and there were all these men sitting around a conference table with braids and wearing suits and looking very official. And my father was in the center. I turned the photograph over, and on one side was a list of all the people who were in the photographs, their Christian names on one side, and their Indian names on the other. As I went down, I really didn't know what my father's Indian name was. In fact, I had very little contact with my father growing up. So I went quickly down the list to my father's name and looked at his his name, which was I'm named after him. And then across from it was his Indian name. And his Indian name was Grizzly Bear. Hmm. And Daryl said to me, he said, you know, maybe it was your dad that was bringing you back home and welcoming you home. And ever since that time, in 10 years that I lived on that cabin on the lake, I probably had well over 400 direct encounters with these, not only grizzly bears, but black bears and brown bears. And I never got over the fact of being frightened or fearsome of them. I was always very careful around them. But I always felt that there was this very special connection since that very first night that I happened to sleep with a bear. There are things that happen to us in life that are unexplainable. And all of us are we have, as a result, a story to tell from those kinds of experiences. Spirituality can be defined on many different ways and levels that I'm not always sure that we will ever fully understand these connections that go beyond our physical existence on this planet. But they do exist, and it is a part of our lives. And that somehow, by just telling you these two stories about my own life and about my experiences, is in its own way, in Native American tradition, a ritual. It's a daily, it's a part of our lives. Every story we have, every story we share, has a purpose beyond just simply communicating. I think sometimes these stories can be stories for healing. They can be stories for increasing our understanding and awareness of the world around us and each other. But most importantly, to recognize that story is a very much an important part of our lives. Now, it's not just in the spoken word that stories are given to each other. I believe that stories come through music, through movement, through dance, through painting, drawing, many different ways. But story is a part of that creative energy that we all share. And sometimes we don't think of ourselves as artists, but in fact we are living. We are a living piece of art. If that's it, I don't know why I said that, but it feels right to me. That if we begin to realize that each moment that we go through life with is an incredible creative experience that we all have and that we all share, and that we are creative in that just by breathing, just by being who we are. In what direction and what purpose, I think we all struggle with that, and I think we try to come to an understanding of the meaning of music and art and dance and ceremony, even the written word. So I guess I've said what I wanted to say today, and I think it's important to just recognize that each of us, whether we are conscious or unconscious of it, are a part of a story. And that just this moment that we're sharing right now is something of a very special spiritual moment. We live this every day, whether we are aware of it or not. And I thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, George.
Thank you for taking the time to tell these stories.
I have some questions. If that's okay.
Sure.
This is John. Did you ever figure out what the bear was eating?
Yeah. As I was talking to the game wardens, these two Indian men, I did ask him that question. I said, how did you get the bear to? I mean, what do you entice them with? And he said, well, at this particular time we had a goat. And what was happening, apparently, was that the bear would reach in and pull off a leg or a piece of the goat and come in and eat with me, and then keep going back until finally he had to go all the way in to get the last piece, and finally was caught.
Okay, that's a good one. And then the next question is going back to your first story, when you started film school and you were starting to make your movie and you were starting to heal yourself somehow, how did you feel? Like, how are you feeling? What was your state of mind?
Well, I think that experience for me was this. It was, I have to say that I'll back up a little bit. I always thought I wanted to be a painter and a sculptor. And I started very young, actually. I started getting national and international recognition when I was 13 years old. I was sort of a prodigy of sorts, and sort of in the press, people wrote about me as being this very special person who could do award-winning. I won my first international competition when I was 13 years old in Zurich. It was a painting. And just prior to finding out I had cancer, I had gone through a period of just real frustration and confusion about my own life and the life I was living as an artist. And I remember having a very bad night with my work, feeling like I was failing as a painter, as an artist. And I literally took a box cutter and cut 14 paintings to shreds.
Oh.
And I found myself sitting on the roof of my studio at night crying. I had reached a point of unhappiness in the way that I was living my life and the way that I was going through life. And I was very confused. I didn't really know what to do about it. And there was a bit of anger, obviously, by tearing up those paintings. But to find out that I had cancer kind of kicked me in the butt a little bit and actually made me sort of rethink about what my life was about. And even though it was kind of a limited view, making a film suddenly became important to me. And how I felt when I started learning how to make films, I felt alive again. That I felt like I had some real defined purpose that I could actually understand and connect with. It was, I'm sure, that confusion that I experienced before about my own finding some sort of affirmation for my being had maybe caused the cancer. Some years later, I read a book by a man named Leonard LeSean. It was a book, the title was You Can Fight for Your Life. He was a psychiatrist who worked with terminally ill patients. His idea was to improve the quality of life in the time that these terminally ill patients had left, whether it was a day or whether it was weeks or months. That he felt psychologically that he wanted to work with these patients to improve their quality of life psychologically. And after 20 years of practice, he found that he had about a 70 to 75% remission rate. That when he was successful in treatment with patients who were terminally ill, that somehow or another he got them back on track. And he expressed in the book a very simple analogy. He said that at times human beings feel that they are on a treadmill they can't get off, and that they're very unhappy on this treadmill, and as a result they just reach over and turn off the immune switch the body has the capability of dealing with cancer, but in many cases when people have it, is that immune system isn't functioning at its optimum. And his belief was that once we reclaim our lives in some fashion, psychologically, that we turn that immune switch back on. So I think in my own way, and as many people I've come to know over the years who have experienced cancer and other diseases that have been challenging, is that once we realize that we reach out and reclaim our lives in a different way, I mean, if we're unhappy with the life that we're living, then let's find a way to move to a place where we can be happy, when we can find some purpose and meaning in our life. A lot of people go through their lives today thinking that there's a certain parameters by which we must live, and without ever thinking about the opportunity of exploring whole new ways of living one's life and viewing one's life. And this is where I feel story is so critical. By sharing stories, by telling stories, even in times when I've been in trouble emotionally and challenged emotionally, that I have found that just simply telling the stories like the stories I've told you tonight has been a form of healing. It has that kind of power. I will say one more story, or share one more story with you. When I was on my reservation, I came in contact with the spiritual side of our people and would go to some of the ceremonies. We have what we call bundle ceremonies. In the spring, we open the bundles and we have the ceremonies that revolve around that. In the fall, when winter comes, we close those bundles up and have ceremonies to do that. And I went to, when I first came home, I started going to the ceremonies and participating in them and finding out that there is this whole other world that I come from, and that history and that knowledge that people have. And my father was very close. One of his very close friends was one of the eldest elders on our reservation and one of the more highly respected spiritual leaders. His name was Buster Yellow Kidney. Buster was 6'6", a tall, lanky man with a great smile. I mean, he had like big horse teeth smile. I mean, he was a beautiful, humorous man. He was always laughing. When I think of Buster, he laughed a lot. And I was shooting a film about the reclamation of Indian land and territory that was lost, that was near our reservation, but it was also a spiritual area that was extremely important, that the federal government was starting to open up oil drilling and fracking projects in that area, and we wanted to kind of stop that. So I was making a film about that, and I wanted Buster to participate by being one of the interviewees. So I heard that he was in a cabin up in the mountains that the tribe had built for our spiritual leaders for their retreats. They would go to this place and spend several weeks or months sometimes charging their batteries, doing ceremonies, doing all kinds of things, but they oftentimes were there alone. So I drove up this long, it took me several hours to drive up into this particular place where this cabin sat. A very simple cabin, 2 rooms, had an old cast iron potbelly stove. As I walked in, there was a table with 2 chairs, nothing matched. And my friend Buster was sitting there with his back facing out to the window. There was something about the posture of this man. He sat erect with his hands on his knees, and he was just looking out the window. He wasn't stiff. It looked as if he couldn't have been more comfortable, but he didn't move. And when I came in or knocked on the door, he said, "Come in." And he said, "There's some coffee on the stove. You may have to heat it up, but help yourself." But he didn't move. And I was struck by how do I say it? I was struck by his being at peace and with himself in that posture. There was no need to have to do any unnecessary movement. And I didn't feel that he was being rude by not looking at me or talking directly to me or welcoming me. He just simply said, "There's coffee on the stove." So there was a little box with some wood in it, and I fired up the stove and I fixed some coffee, and I asked him if he wanted a cup, and he said yes. And sat there in quiet, in silence. And after a while he asked me why I had come, and I told him I wanted to interview him, and told him about what I was doing, and he agreed. And then again there was silence. And then it came to my mind, because he was noted as a great healer in our community. And I asked him, I said, "Buster, I've always wanted to ask you. I don't want to know any deep secrets of any kind. But what is it about how you heal, what is it that you do that enables you to be a healer?" And he had this big laugh, and he slapped his knees, and he laughed and laughed, and I just thought, well, I must have asked a stupid question here. And he then turned and looked at me directly in the eye, and he said, "You know, George, the only thing I can tell you is that it's how I live. It's what I put in my mind and in my heart and in my soul. Each and every waking moment, when I wake up, the first thing that I do is surrender to the world. And I try to live and do everything that I do, every act, every bit of my daily routine is based on living with integrity. If I get in a car, am I driving someplace for myself, or am I driving someplace to help someone? Am I using the resources that this earth, this planet has given me in the right way? Am I using my body in the right way? Am I helping my people? And he says, then when it comes time to go to these ceremonies where healing is asked for and required, all I have to do is be present. And it kind of shocked me a little bit, the simplicity of what he was saying to me. He says, the integrity by which we live has a power that all one has to do is be present among others for that power to be a benefit to others. And I was always struck by that. Buster died a few months later in his 90s, but he was a very, very knowledgeable and wonderful man in my life. So I share him with you tonight.
Thank you.
George, we have a question from Andrea, who's watching remotely. Actually, she has a couple questions, but the first one is, she said that she missed what you said when you first recognized that it was a bear outside your tent. Something about giving up or letting go?
Yes. You know, I've been around a lot of people and saying that it's important to recognize that when we are challenged, and Buster said this to me actually. Buster said, when our greatest gifts in life are our greatest challenges. And when we are able to look at those challenges in that fashion, then we, in a way, in our own way, are surrendering to the reality that is in front of us. We're not creating not what we think is happening. It is what it is. And that we cannot wish it something to be something else. Oftentimes, I think as human beings, we want to identify or to categorize or to say that a certain experience in life is a certain way. It's not so important to identify it as it is to recognize that it exists. And I think this is what he was talking about to me. And when I was confronted with this enormous fear that I was feeling inside, I had to some way let that go and to just recognize the moment that I was in. And maybe somewhere in there would be a solution to my problem. Or just simply accepting my own death in that moment. I had to see that as a possibility and to accept that and to honor that. Sounds strange to say to honor your moment of death, but I think that's something that comes out of my Native American tradition, is that every moment is an opportunity to honor.
I have a question. What do you think are the universal qualities of great stories?
The human, the truth. Sometimes somebody said to me one time that in every truth there's a lie. In every lie there's the truth. And how we define what truth is sometimes not always correct. And I think the most, and let me stop right there. Say the question one more time.
What are the most important qualities of great stories? And mostly by that I mean great storytelling, like how it's told.
Well, I think the act of storytelling, some of us feel like, well, we can't tell a story. And I think the qualities is essentially when someone is in the moment. I was thinking about how to prepare for this evening and what I was going to say. I didn't want to get too uptight about it, so I didn't do a whole lot of thinking about it. I often find that if I just release myself, then I'm a little more capable of telling the stories I need to tell. But the qualities of a good story to me is that ability to accept ourselves in the process, that we can tell a story. I'm getting maybe here's what I want to say. Some years ago, a Native man came to me, and I was telling some stories to a group of people. And he says, I know the story you're telling. It was a traditional story, a story that's told many times in my tribe. And he says, I heard it a different way, and my belief is that you've got to tell it the same way every time. And I don't know where it came from, but inside of me something said, no, that's not true. For a story to have its validity and its power, the person telling the story must bring something of themselves to the story. And the qualities of a good story is when someone injects themselves into the telling of that story, some part of themselves, some sense of relevancy for them about that story has to be a part of it. Otherwise, the story will become stagnant. If it's told exactly with the same words, the same way, and only one way, without the storyteller's involvement, then it's no longer has the power that it has. This is the reason why I think that traditional storytellers over the years, over the thousands of years, the millenniums, that stories can exist throughout all that time because each storyteller brings a new meaning and a new life to that story. And therefore, stories really don't have power unless they have relevance.
What's your opinion about when stories become religion, become fundamentalist?
Well, again, I just go back to what I just got through saying.
Okay. So it's not important is truth or not? Is it important? Is the story's truth?
Well, I mean, the power, it will either be there or it won't be. In other words, if someone is utilizing it in a way to manipulate, then I consider that a dishonor. That if you have a purpose for telling that story, that you want to manipulate some circumstance or situation or someone, then it doesn't have power. It may in the moment, on some level, someone may be fooled or someone may think that, you know, it's the truth, but in time they will come to understand that it's not.
But don't you think that these stories of religion have in some ways destroyed the Native American culture?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I mean, you know, I think one of the big, besides the physical aspect of Europeans' presence, which we got influenza and smallpox and all kinds of diseases which wiped a good majority of us out, there was the religious onslaught, and they came through.
It was down in the name of the Bible. Yeah, missionary. They heathens. You were heathens. Yeah, to them.
Right, and it still is to this day. I remember growing up and hearing about missionaries in Brazil and going into some of these areas with the Yanomamo, who had no contact with the outside world until these missionaries arrived. And again, the destruction that's happened since because of that kind of contact has been tragic. I'm not here to say that stories can't be damaging, and that the concept of what a truth or a lie is as I said before, in every lie there is a truth, and those who are susceptible to that will be fooled, and others who are cautious and aware will take what is important to them. Another elder said to me one time, I got very ill one time eating some food with another friend of mine. I ended up in the hospital. He ate the same food I ate, and he visited me in the hospital completely well. And I said to him, I don't understand why I got so sick, and I'm in here for 10 days, and they're pumping all kinds of antibiotics and all kinds of things into me, and pumping my stomach and so forth. And he said, nothing happened to you. And he said, well, I was raised, he was a Pueblo Indian from New Mexico, and he says, when we eat, we always do a prayer, whether it's out loud or whether it's internal. We accept what is good for us by eating this food. And what's not good for us, we pray that it will pass by. And he says it's a very simple prayer. In fact, how we do the prayer is we take a little piece of each portion of the food, and like a piece of bread, and we dip it in all of the different foods that are on the plate, and we lay it as an offering on the floor. But in that, we are saying thank you for the blessing of having this food, and thank you for this life and this way of life that I have. And whatever is good in this food, let it come into my body, and whatever is bad, let it pass. I think there's a...
That's a good analogy, yes.
I'm sorry to cut you off a little bit, George. It's about time for us to move on, but we want to ask you one more question. We're asking everybody about energy. And of course, there's energy that gets passed in the artistic process from one person to the other. But we're wondering, what do you think is energy? And what is the fundamental sort of, where does it come from? What is it made of?
Oh, boy. Nothing like an easy question. No, I think about it oftentimes. I don't find myself wanting to always have an answer for everything, and this is one of those instances which for me is to understand that energy does exist, and it exists on many different levels, and that my ability to see and experience it is varied. In the stories that I was telling you about tonight, as well as many other stories that we all can tell, is that there is a variety of experiences that we've all had, and we have every day and every moment, by which we know that energy does exist. On what kind, how to label it, is really not so important to me anymore as it used to be. To define why I'm able to see someone after they have passed from this earth, that they've left their body, and I've actually been able to see someone. There's obviously energy there. There's obviously a reason why I'm able to see them and to even at times hear them. For me to describe what I think that is, I probably wouldn't be able to do it in 1,000 lifetimes. But what's so more important to me is that it does exist, and that I've had that experience, and that I will share that with others, as hopefully somewhere down the line we'll understand why those things happen to us.
Okay, well, thank you so much, George.
Yeah, thank you very much, George,
Thanks,
for taking
George.
the time to tell us.
Thank you.
Thank you.